Hello, dear friends. This is this time again when we talk about music, and it seems that sometimes I wonder: is it even important to talk about music? Looking at what's going on in the world and what we are actually experiencing, I mean, something so surreal that it's hard to even describe in words. Not only the obvious catastrophe of the pandemic, but the total meltdown and racial sort of explosion of what's happening in the United States. So is it important to talk about music? Or maybe to me, that's the only thing that I can really talk about without feeling totally agitated and depressed and confused. So music again comes to rescue here. And this time it is Tchaikovsky. And it was many of you who suggested last time that we should pick a composer that everybody loves and a composer that needs no introduction. And that's, of course, Tchaikovsky. And it has a lot to do also with the fact that in Tonhalle Zurich, with the Tonhalle Orchestra, we have embarked on a cycle of Tchaikovsky symphonies. And in fact, just before the shutdown of the world and the musical world especially, and the cancellations of all the concerts, we were about to finish the project of Tchaikovsky symphonies. In fact, we were in the dress rehearsal of the Third Symphony when we were given notice that we are not able to do the concert, and we are not going to be performing that evening. So Tchaikovsky has been on my mind for a while now, and to be before any of the questions, I will just tell you shortly my relationship to Tchaikovsky. The one of the greatest composers and one of the composers that were played most often in Soviet Union, and during when I was growing up in Soviet Union. Estonia was part of Soviet Union, for those of you who don't know. There was a almost no two ways about how Tchaikovsky symphonies were supposed to be interpreted. There was one great guru, and that was Mravinsky. Mravinsky was the legendary kind of autocratic maestro, music director of Leningrad Symphony. And his Tchaikovsky was considered the kind of ultimate perfection and the ultimate statement in the Tchaikovsky symphonies. It was very dry, it was very powerful, it was incredibly well organized, it was fantastically played, it was not sentimental, it was not warm, it was something that was very classical, and in a sense that there was a proportion and structure that was extremely well observed. Mravinsky was famous for not having a very large repertoire, and he would conduct the same pieces and would rehearse them endlessly. And Tchaikovsky symphonies 4, 5, 6 were in his repertoire, and he would rehearse them, in fact, as long as he felt was necessary before he announced the concert. The concert was announced only when he felt that they were ready to play the concert, and it was not like we have now a kind of a normal subscription idea that ready or not, we are playing on next Thursday and there is nothing we can do about it. And Turanga Lila Symphony gets exactly the same amount of rehearsals as a Haydn Symphony. Union and laws, and incredibly sort of, well, practically inflexible system. That's how I knew our reality in the Soviet times, especially in the early Soviet times. That was not the case. So what I can tell you that I loved those pieces when I was young, and I heard my father perform them, and it was very often performed. I mean, only 4, 5, 6, not so much the others, and of course the concerti as well. The first concerto and the violin concerto. Second concerto less. Third almost never. And then there are a lot of pieces by Tchaikovsky that I never ever heard before I came to the West, because they simply were not played. I think the mentality in Russia was such that you don't play everything, you only play the best music. And it is something that some people still hold on to. And, I must say that I personally like to explore, and that has certainly happened. And I've sort of gotten this trait from my father, who is an endless explorer. He to this day, he's only exploring new music. And so there is this sort of the gene that came from him. What happened at one point that I actually gave up Tchaikovsky and thought that it's not really very good music. And I know that I'm sort of ashamed to say it now, but at one point I felt that it was just not really great music. Somehow I didn't feel it was very inspired, and I felt it was overplayed, and there are sort of endless traditions which never made really much sense. And what happened when Soviet orchestras were touring is that the orchestras would go and play 25 concerts or maybe even more in a row, and for almost no money, and they would play the same program. So that was an orchestra, the great Russian orchestra, they would know it impeccably, and there was a certain automatic pilot, and you could hear that there was not so much creativity, but there was unbelievable tightness to the performances, and they could do this in their sleep. And something about that really started to kind of grate on me and turn me off the music of especially the symphonies of Tchaikovsky. And for a long period of time, I just gave up on them. I didn't conduct them. And then slowly, and it was again because I was listening to the Bernstein at the very end of his life, when he was taking on the Tchaikovsky symphony cycle with New York Philharmonic. And everybody I remember was talking, oh, Lenny is typical Lenny. He's so self-indulgent. He's living through these pieces as if he's writing them on the spot, and all the rubati and all the things that were exaggerated to a person or ear of a person who is used to the traditional performances. And that is when a little bit of the sort of light bulb sort of went on in my head, and saying, "Oh, that's it. That's what I always missed." And this kind of extreme passion and extreme pain and suffering and all the exaggerated emotions and contrasts that Lenny just dared to bring up. Somehow made me get back and start exploring Tchaikovsky again, and obviously also it's something to do with the personal growth, and you become a little bit more confident in doing or being able to do what you want to do, and therefore you start experimenting. And that's where I got to the point where with Tonhalle I thought this is a perfect moment, because for Tchaikovsky you also need a great orchestra. So this is a perfect moment to really get into it and record. And in fact, we already have done all of them with the exception of 3 and 1. And the 5th symphony is coming out in September, in fact. So I hope you check it out. Charles Coleman, wonderful composer and a friend, is the first one here asking a question. Hi there, Paavo. How is your opinion the audience who applaud after the third movement of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony? Riccardo Muti once scolded the audience for doing that. Well, it is a very funny thing. I usually don't mind when people applaud, but I am not necessarily too unhappy if the people don't applaud during the movements either, because I think that in a way, in an ideal world, people would be connected enough to the whole performance so that they would not necessarily automatically start applauding on emotion. I can certainly understand after the first movement of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto, okay, that is sort of designed for the applause. In fact, I know a lot of violinists who get a little disappointed when the musicians or the audience does not applaud during the after the first movement. The thing with the sixth is a little complicated because the kind of march that leads to the end of the third movement of the sixth is a kind of very often. It can be taken as a kind of a very lighthearted, and there's nothing lighthearted about this. It's a kind of march to death, and then comes the last movement to the real kind of lamentoso, when you really feel that he puts all his feelings and emotions into that music. So in a way, it's like March to Hell. I've seen Muti conduct that, and in fact, Muti is a very good conductor. But I mean, he does it with such an Italian flair that after that, it's very difficult not to applaud. I mean, so there is a one could say that it probably has a lot to do with the genius of the piece, that audience simply cannot sit still and wait for the next movement because it's so exciting, the tension is so high. On the other hand, if there was a little less Verdi in it, they would probably not have this much impulse to applaud either. So I think there is a little bit of the blame is on both sides, I suppose. In general, I don't mind if the audience applauds during the movements, unless it is a Mahler symphony where there is a larger narrative, and when there is things are philosophical, and applauding would just mean that audience simply don't understand, or maybe you haven't done a good enough job to make them understand what actually goes on, and that is a part of the bigger picture. Let's say what the next question here is. Oh, there's a lot of questions. Thank you for joining. This is actually such a wonderful thing to see so many people of you. I hope that I don't miss too many questions. Which symphonies of Tchaikovsky do you like to conduct most, apart from Pathetique? I really love to listen to first from you, especially one with Frankfurt Symphony on YouTube. You know, it may have something to do with just me personally, but I have thought about and sort of anticipated this question and thought about in general which symphonies do I like, not only in Tchaikovsky, but with other composers. And I have come to a conclusion that I tend to like all the ones that are not popular. I love the first and second and fourth of Beethoven. I love the first, second, and third of Tchaikovsky. The third of Brahms is my absolute favorite, and so on and so on. I do get, and there is no question about the greatness of the 6 and 4 and 5. I personally find the early symphonies fresher because they are less performed, of course. And I also find that the first symphony, particular, has something that Tchaikovsky afterwards never kind of, in his symphonies at least, never recovered. And there is this wonderful, wonderful naivete, simplicity. This just the beginning, the way he starts. This kind of beautiful, and it's not a very profound melody, but it's dreamy, and it has a certain. It's floating in the air, and of course he's using. If you read the orchestration books of Berlioz or even Glazunov, they say never use. The worst two instruments to use together is the flute and bassoon, and of course this is exactly the instruments he's using in this first symphony, and they work so perfectly well together. And so don't trust everything that you read in orchestration books by the greats, because it works in Tchaikovsky's. And I can say that yes, some of the development moments and some of the way he develops is a bit clumsy, and the clumsiness is part of being young and part of being inexperienced. But what he has and gains, and what we still have to this day, is a certain vulnerability and woundability that I think later on he's masking with a very kind of, he has become more of a master, knows how to make symphonies sound more more accomplished structurally, form-wise, and so on, but losing a little bit of that personal touch that the first symphonies, especially the very first one, has. How can you break down how actually pronounce his name? Tchaikovsky. I don't know. To us who speak Russian, we don't even never think of this name being difficult to pronounce. Russian, the T in Russia is chai. So in American Union terms, it could be a teamster, but that's a joke. So the T, something to do with tea. I have to think of. But Tchaikovsky is the right way. In Russian, they say Tchaikovsky. There is a certain roundness to it. Mark, hello. This is nice to see you again. Good evening, Paavo. A lot of people are sniffy about Tchaikovsky, casting his music as over-sentimental, but there are few composers who are such gifted melodists. I agree with you, and I think that I sort of felt at one point a little bit like it's too sentimental, and then I felt that it's not sentimental enough in terms of performance practice. It's a question of a performance. A person who truly loves the symphonies and who has something to say will find the right balance. This is a very good question. It's very difficult to know where this fine line actually is, because one of the things that every orchestra in the world can play from sight, mostly badly, but from sight, are the 4, 5, and 6 of Tchaikovsky. If you go to any English orchestra, they'll just play Tchaikovsky 5, and they say, well, we don't need much rehearsal for that. We know this music. And then it's going to be sort of a very, very well executed routine and totally sort of lacking of poetry kind of performance that is going to sound just fine. And everybody says, well, that was jolly good. And that's exactly what they will say in England. And that's pretty much where it stays. And I think that in order to bring out the specialness of it, one needs time, and one needs to actually treat this music and all the really great and overplayed pieces need to be treated every time as if you are doing them for the first time, or at least try to imagine what was it when they first heard this music. You know, I mean, Tchaikovsky First Symphony, First Piano Concerto, Violin Concerto, they were all disasters in the beginning. Nobody wanted to play the Violin Concerto. Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto was so badly criticized by Rubinstein that I mean, he said, I have nothing to say. This is just arpeggios, and it's not good. It's not good music. And so anyway, you know, if you start thinking of the critical response to his music, it was brutal in the beginning, and he persevered. He certainly proved us all and all of them wrong. What I find more disturbing is not the question of it being overly sentimental. I think it often becomes just business as usual. Very often, it is heard as, and really well played, but business as usual, without any kind of sense of really personal input. I remember, I don't remember now, was it Michael Tilson Thomas or was it Zinman? I forgot who told the story, but I was in LA, a student, and I think it was Michael Tilson Thomas who said that when he went to Philadelphia Orchestra as a young boy, and did a Tchaikovsky Fifth, and orchestra sort of, they didn't have much rehearsal time, and orchestra said, do you want Stokowski version or you want Ormandy version? Basically, I mean, one was a bit more over the top, another one was a bit straightforward. But basically, Tchaikovsky symphonies are seen as sort of, we all know it. Don't start reinventing the wheel. That's very often the attitude, and I think that is exactly what you need to do. You need to reinvent the wheel with these pieces every single time you do them. Hello from Bolivia. I am very happy that we have people from Bolivia listening. Wonderful to have you with us. Another question from Mark Pullinger. In your opinion, what are symphonies 1 to 3? Why are symphonies 1 to 3 performed so rarely? It's just that they are not good box office. If they were performed more often, audience would lap them up. I agree with you 100%, and I totally agree with this whole dilemma and the paradox. The paradox is this: is that we all want to hear things that we know and love, and I don't know why is it like this, because I am sometimes craving for things that I don't know. But if I remember so clearly, when my girls were very young, they always said, "Can you play this piece again?" Or can you tell us the same bedtime story? Because they loved that one story and they just wanted to hear it over and over. Because we have, I guess, as people, this need or pull towards something that we know and like. I suppose it's human nature, and I think it's kind of logical in one way. And then we become, that's what the top 40 in pop music, it's the hits, and then people will be known by the music that became a hit, even though they could actually write some other music that is just as wonderful, but maybe is not designed for such a repeated listening or a large audience. And the paradox then is that all the promoters in orchestras and concert managers and orchestra managers and all the people who deal with programming and all the people who deal with sponsorships in the orchestras, they all say, well, yes, but it's a great piece. I personally love it, but it's not, we need box office, and then let's do, instead of 5 instead of 2, let's do 5, and so on. It's the same with Beethoven, the same with every other composer. And then gradually, the repertoire that we consider box office bankable in box office becomes shorter, and list becomes smaller and smaller. And at the end, we have sort of put ourselves in the situation because we listen to the audience. In fact, I think that we need to be always partly educating the audience, not in a pedantic sort of listen to this, my friends, kind of a way, but seduce and introduce them to the music and to the pieces that they will then want to come back to. And of course, let's also face it, if a person is going to do a famous piece, and most likely they will do it better. If you do a piece that is new to you and orchestra doesn't know the piece, and the audience doesn't know the piece, of course there is going to be a little bit more doubt. It's maybe not going to be such a sure thing when you go on stage, but at the same time you keep a part of the repertoire alive, and you maybe draw attention to some of the music that has been unjustly neglected. I thought, for example, the Second Symphony of Tchaikovsky, what a fantastic piece. If you really have a guts to do it in a way that music starts speaking and leaping off the page. We did it in Pärnu in my festival last year. And, we have an exceptionally good orchestra there, of sort of all-star orchestra. So the finale that usually is taken very slowly, we took in a tempo that I felt needs to be taken in this last moment, which is quite presto and quite fast. And all of a sudden, these repeating sequences, the long sequences that Tchaikovsky is well known for, they didn't become, they had more logic, and there was a better form and better structure. And it was an interesting thing because Pärnu is a place where a lot of older Russian musicians come to spend their summers and retire and so on. And one of the old musicians from Russia who came to the concerts, he said, I never liked the Second Symphony all my life that I lived and listened to it in Moscow, and today I liked it. He said, and he wasn't sure why, but he said, today I liked it. And it's because one needs to dare, and my father always used this expression, which may sound a little weird to some of you, but I totally stand by it, and I think it's totally the right way of looking at pieces. You sometimes have to know how to help, how to facilitate the composer, and not always say, well, he didn't write an accelerando here, or he didn't say do this or do that. Composers often rely on the imagination and musical instinct and ability of the performer. So in a way, knowing when to get past the passages which are a little clumsy, especially in the early symphonies of Tchaikovsky, there is nothing wrong with it. It just shows that you are talented and that you're thinking. Hello, Maestro. What do you look for a musician auditioning for your orchestra? Well, to be honest with you, the audition process in a normal orchestra is so well regulated, and it's so fair to the point where it's almost too fair. But let me explain. If I wouldn't really necessarily lean towards less fair practice. That's for sure. I think that the behind the screen auditions, I think they could at one point become almost inhuman. But what do I look in Pärnu, in my Estonian festival orchestra? What do I look in musician or for musician in an orchestra where, in an ideal world, if I could, let's say, choose each musician by myself, I look for all the same qualities that I look for in any other human being. who is my friend. It needs to be, first of all, a good person. It needs to be a person who you have a wonderful musical and human connection, a person who is an undisputed master of the instrument, who has range, a person who I can learn from. If you have a talented orchestra, every time in Pärnu, I sometimes am about to rehearse, and then I think, wait a minute, what our solo clarinet did just right now is so much better than anything that I would say, and I would just make a mental note and say, this is the way it should be actually done. So I learn a lot from individual musicians, and the same thing with your friends. And so basically you look for the same qualities. You look for the professionalism, you look for the being master of the instrument. But for me, a team player who knows and treats music as a living thing, as a chamber music, rather than, I'm right and here you're wrong and I'm right. This kind of thinking, which happens sometimes in orchestra, but it's not for me really something that I can understand. I don't know. I often say to the musicians, in this particular case, it's not so important to be right. It's important to be together, so do something and play so that this place is together, rather than insisting on who is right and who is wrong. But it's also the human qualities. Sometimes being right is not necessarily the most important thing in a conversation. I already pronounced Tchaikovsky, so I have another question here. Please pronounce it one more time. Tchaikovsky. I think Tchaikovsky took too much care of his surroundings. He's the opposite of Mozart. Well, I don't know about Tchaikovsky. It's hard to know about his life. And, there are so many mysteries about his life and so many strange and sometimes unbelievable stories about what kind of person he was. And, this whole story of him marrying first and then disastrous divorce, and then this long relationship with a Nadezhda von Meck, who was the benefactor and a kind of a guardian angel who allowed him to write, basically, because he financially depended on her, and there was a kind of a relationship that only really was expressed in letters. And there were thousands of letters written by Tchaikovsky to Nadezhda von Meck. And in fact, this is one of those moments where you feel it would be so nice if the internet didn't exist, that we could still write letters to each other, because through these letters we actually find out a lot about Tchaikovsky's life and about, in his own words, the whole. He was a famous hypochondriac. He always felt uncomfortable in crowds. He was very awkward in public. He was very private, and of course, something that everybody sort of knew in Russia. It was never mentioned, but it was obvious, and a very important part of the key to his music is the fact that he was homosexual. And in a time where, in that time in Russia, that was not only looked down upon; it was a crime. It was punishable by death. And in fact, to this day, Russia is maybe one of the most homophobic countries in the world, and the culture doesn't hide the kind of disdain for homosexuals. But it is almost sanctioned by the government. But at that time, it was sort of a death sentence, and it was a scandal of immense proportions. And the reason he died, and how he died, and we in school were taught that he drank water, the contaminated water, and he died of cholera. But we all know that most likely it was a suicide because of his affair with somebody up very up high came to light, and he was simply given no choice but to kill himself. But that aspect, I think, needs to be brought out. If you listen to Mravinsky performances of Tchaikovsky, you would never know that Tchaikovsky was gay. And I think that there is something missing if we don't hear this in his performances. I see his violin concerto is one of the most moving pieces of art in the history of human civilization, yet a lot of people have never heard it. What is the story behind this masterpiece, and how do you make it mandatory listening for music appreciation? Well, you're right. I mean, there are very few pieces that are more famous than Tchaikovsky violin concerto. But then again, we are speaking as musicians and people who are in the music industry and music world, and people who also love classical music. One of the ways to make it mandatory, I don't necessarily feel that we have any way to make dictate anything or make anything mandatory necessarily, but early exposure, and I think when it comes to any kind of education, any developing love or a taste for anything, be it food or be it music or sweets or animals or anything, just the way people learn from their parents, that's the way they should learn also music. And if a parent plays classical music at home and plays Tchaikovsky violin concerto, I mean, I don't think there's going to be too much mystery. A young person will immediately connect with it because it is beautiful, it's melodic. But it's again a question of early exposure. One of the reasons why Tchaikovsky is somewhat better known than other composers in the United States, for example, is because of this tradition of Nutcracker, and some of his best, maybe some people argue that the best music that Tchaikovsky ever wrote was for the ballets. I mean, of course, the Nutcracker in the beginning, but then also Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty. I mean, it is this all sort of epic, great music that everybody, even if they don't know it's by Tchaikovsky, have heard, and it's impossible not to love. The violin concerto is something that much to the surprise of a lot of people now who feel it's overplayed. It was a piece that he couldn't sort of convince people to play in the beginning, and it was not well received, and it didn't really fit the form, so to speak, and it's a good example in music history where not everything that sort of bombs in the beginning needs to be immediately discarded as second rate. I mean, some of the greatest pieces of music had huge initial failures and initial disappointments from great composers, including Schumann and many others. So violin concerto certainly is one of the most touching, and the second movement of it is just one of the most incredibly human moments in music history. But to me, I always go back to the basic thing. Music and love for music starts at home, and it can never be too early. In fact, music needs to be played to a stomach of a pregnant woman. In fact, we certainly had this, and my kids heard music when they were still in the womb, and I'm sure that first of all, it can't hurt, but it gets you into the sort of a higher sphere of feeling, and this is something that I would make mandatory, is that classical music should be played at home if I was in a position to make such rules. But of course, it is everybody's decision. Right now, most of the time, it's not the case, because it doesn't anymore hold the place in our everyday life where it would be a common thing to do in a young families. It's mostly pop music now. Am I right that there are similar themes between his violin concerto and the Fifth Symphony? I don't think that they are exactly the same, but there is a similar feel, especially to the slow movement. There is a certain singing and melodic. Tchaikovsky as a melodist is sort of unbeatable. Very few people have a gift that is that amazing when it comes to melodies. I mean, Tchaikovsky seems that his melodies they just happen, and there are many of them, and everybody always can whistle them, and people always they're very memorable, and so this is the true genius, and it's something that I guess it cannot really be learned, but certainly he had a gift of melody. I mean, some great composers didn't. Some of the great composers, like if we look at Beethoven, I mean, there are some nice melodies, but it's not exactly a composer that is known or thought about the melodic along the melodic lines. It's mostly about his working through and his development of material that we know him. I'm very happy to see that we have people from Chile. This is very nice, and also from Paraguay. God, we have a very interesting and varied audience today. Welcome. Very nice to have you here. Now a question from Japan. It's pointed out that 3 masterpieces were composed imminent anticipation of death: Mozart's Requiem, Mahler 9, Tchaikovsky 6. Do you feel anything musically unusual conducting Tchaikovsky 6? I think that of all the symphonies of Tchaikovsky, the 6 clearly stands out because exactly of what you were just mentioning, this sense of autobiographical and quite kind of final statement, and you feel that he really puts everything that he has learned and felt and experienced in his life into this very last moment. And in that way, it's very hard to just treat it as a piece of music. With you go in with an understanding that was the final statement, it was the final utterance. So yes, you do feel a little bit different than, let's say, playing the Fifth Symphony or Fourth Symphony, because the sixth one is a kind of a farewell. Same with Mahler. Mozart's a little different thing. There's very little Mozart in Mozart Requiem. So there is mostly the Mozart Requiem is music by other people, and there is the music that Mozart wrote is a genius and unbelievable music, but but it is a clearly unfinished work, and at the most amazing moment he sort of stopped writing. It was a middle of Lacrimosa. Tchaikovsky himself said that it's the finale of the Sixth is the best thing that he's ever written, and he said, I don't think that I can do any better or any more than this. So yeah, it is a little bit different conducting Sixth and conducting, for example, a Nutcracker suite, because you don't feel that this is the end of somebody's life, and now we all know that it is the end. So yeah, these pieces you approach, even if you don't want to approach them differently, you can't help it. It happens. Hello, Maestro. Thank you so much for doing this. For the Fifth Symphony, first movement, Tchaikovsky gave a metronome marking of the first theme, dot 104, which the second theme is 92. How much, which is much faster than how people perform and record it. What is your take of the metronome marking as we discuss in topic spectrum and symphonies? Well, it's an interesting question because as far as I know, they were not given by Tchaikovsky, but they were editors' markings. But there is something that we have to now, and forgive me if I say something politically incorrect, but if a German composer gives you metronome markings, you tend to believe it. I don't believe much of anything that's given in the text of a Russian composer or Russian publisher, for that matter. Most of the texts were a disaster during the Soviet time. The texts were printed with mistakes, including Shostakovich and Prokofiev symphonies. They are still a mess. Even the new edition is full of mistakes. And all the proofreading and all the basic logistic work and the quality of scholarship, not scholarship itself, but what gets translated when it gets out of the hands of the scholars, is not necessarily something that I believe. Also, knowing the Russian nature, it is a culture that is not, if anything, it's not pedantic. It's not a culture that will discuss too adamantly about the dot or a double dot. If they could say it's a mistake or it's not a mistake, but the interpretations of all these things are much less. How should I say it? Exact, and much more is expected and is left to an interpreter. That's why you see, 5 performances of Tchaikovsky violin concerto, and you see literally 5 different pieces. If they are truly big and important musical minds, I'll give you an example. If you listen to a Tchaikovsky violin concerto with Kavakos, and then you listen to Janine Janssen, then you don't think it's the same piece, and they are both totally convincing. They're totally sort of convey the story. So in the symphonies, it's the same thing. I think a lot of people who I find convincing in the symphonies are the ones who dare to have much more imagination and personal say and take more license than it is sort of customarily usually expected, and to me that makes the music more interesting. If you listen to really sort of famous old Russian, I'm not talking about Rozhdestvinsky or Timerkanov or Svetanov, but if you listen to the earlier ones like Golovanov, for example, I mean, you don't even think that you ever heard this piece. I mean, the fluctuations and rumbati, it's a little bit similar to listen to Mengelberg in his interpretations of well, pretty much any music. He just takes liberties and treats the score as if it's a blueprint to something that he then freely interprets. Let's see. Now I have unfortunately skipped so many that I have to scroll back here and see what I have missed. I can see a lot of friendly and nice names. Okay. An interesting question has nothing to do with Tchaikovsky, of course, but I'll answer this anyway. Said Maestro, who are the contemporary composers you like? Well, that's a little off the subject, but we are free to do what we want here. So contemporary people, if we talk about the people who are still alive, then clearly for me, Arvo Pärt, Erkki Sven Tüür. But I have many friends who write music. I mean, Charles Coleman is a good friend who writes wonderful music. And I have been very lucky to have had a very close contact and many pieces that I premiered during my years in Paris, from Richard Dubignon, Karol Beffa, Terry Eskesh, just to name very few. There are many more who are very good. And we are now premiering a piece by Tõnu Kõrvits this summer. Abrahamson horn concerto. We did the world premiere with Stefan Dorr, fantastic horn player, in Berlin Philharmonic just a couple months ago. So there, the music music scene is quite active, and I think that there's a whole interesting layer and generation of people coming on to the scene that are writing wonderful music. So to me, these are the people who are the new music people. One can put contemporary also into a larger frame, which would then include people like Dutilleux and Messiaen, two great, in my opinion. But there are a lot of interesting people who, Jörg Widmann, for example, who has written a couple of pieces for me and whose music is absolutely exceptional and wonderful. But there are more, and I will have forgotten many names right now because it's slightly off the subject. But the music, Thomas Adès is a fantastic composer, and many others. All right. Hello, Felix. Hi, Paavo. In your opinion, how Russian is Tchaikovsky's music? It's a very, very, you always ask very insightful questions, Felix. I find that Tchaikovsky is not very Russian. And now you will think that I have gone crazy and lost my mind. But let me explain. I find that Tchaikovsky is the most Western aristocratic Russian with undoubted Russian soul and sentiment. And of course, if we start, putting in a larger picture, it's Russian. But if I think of real Russian music, the music that simply could not have been written by anybody but a kind of, Russian who has never seen any other place in the world, then we talk about people like Mussorgsky. If you listen to Lyadov, Glinka, there's a whole list of Rimsky-Korsakov even, and the kind of Russians who were not influenced or in fact really hated the influence of the West, and who really believed that they are the guardians of the real Russian music. I mean, if we listen to Mussorgsky is a very good example. If you listen to Mussorgsky, you know that this music is not influenced by any sort of French sensibilities or Western sensibilities. There is no piece in Mussorgsky says that that has Souvenir de Florence and all the kind of aristocratic influences that Tchaikovsky has. I don't take anything away from Tchaikovsky and his sense of on certain level, of course, very Russian. But if we really put it in perspective within the Russian musical firmament, then he's the Western Russian. He is the sophisticated Russian. He's somebody who has had incredible connection to the Western world, who traveled, who has all the famous Capriccio Espagnols, and you name it. There is a sense of cosmopolitan understanding of the world, and that reflects also in his symphonies. His music uses and is Russian, but always within a certain wonderfully proportioned and very tasteful way, close to also Western symphonic tradition. Something you couldn't say about Glinka or Lyadov, for example. So so in that way, he's less Russian than many other Russians, but he is, of course, very Russian. I don't know, does this make any sense to you? But this is how I feel. A nice question, nice comment. Tchaikovsky adds more and more depth to his music. He's a specialist in 3D technology, so to speak. I suppose as he gets older, he adds layers and layers and layers, and certainly. Stephen Isilis is writing. I'll ask you a question. He has depth, that's for sure, but like all the great composers, it comes with time. Stephen Isilis writes here, I'm sitting here with Maestro Mutti, and he says he finds you, Tchaikovsky, too Estonian. Well, that might be so. Please say hello to Maestro, please. Another interesting observation from France, he says, I think when you perform the third movement, play almost attacca into the fourth. I do this very, very much on purpose, because I do find the actual applause so incredibly disturbing that it sort of breaks the story and makes the story very hard to retell. One thing that you lose when you do the attacca is the actual preparation of the orchestra to really give everything that they have for the first attack of the finale. And this thing has to be well coordinated, and it has to have ultimate and precision, but power and depth. And it's very difficult to get it really optimal, get it as together and as colorful when you have to run for time and you hope that you get in there before somebody starts clapping. So I am not sure that me going attacca is a good idea, but I know that if I can avoid the applause, then it will be worth it. So in concerts, I always do it. Maybe I'll stop doing it at one point, but right now it is just a desperate attempt to not hear this one clap. Usually it's people are stunned by the end of the third movement, and then you hear this, and then you don't know what's happening, because most people don't want to hear it either, and then one enthusiastic listener sort of can't help it. And or sometimes it is what happens in concerts is if you have a lot of people and they are so excited and they are so incredibly what's the right word? They're so incredibly taken by the intensity that with a minute the music stops, people start coughing, because there is a sense of you just need to somehow, it's a physical reaction, and it's not necessarily that you even have to cough, but you have to somehow breathe, and so this excessive coughing and clapping could be really disastrous there. Between these two, usually I don't mind, but just between these two moments I really don't like to hear any noise. How do you feel about the finale of the fifth? Is it really a triumph over fate? It feels like a very hollow victory to me. You are absolutely right. I don't think it's triumph at all. I think the end is tragic, and I don't. We all sort of are taught various scenarios in our studies and by different people about what these pieces represent, and I don't find the finale of the fifth happy or triumphant. It's triumphant in one way, that it has the character of majesty and triumph, but it is not a sort of victorious and I won and I conquered kind of movement. Absolutely not. I feel the same way. I don't find that it is a triumph over fate. I think that it is maybe fate has triumphed over him as a person in a way, and and it's much more tragic than many people feel or many people think about. Okay. Another person says, I'm sitting here with Piotr Il'ich and he doesn't prefer approach to the Rococo variations. We have a lot of interesting composers and conductors joining our conversation. Say hello to Piotr Il'ich. So he's alive. There is a fine line between madness and genius. That's for sure. That's for sure. And I think that really the greatest of them all have been very, very close to madness. I mean, it's maybe always not only in music. I mean, if you look what happens in America right now. You have people who we all call when we need help, and who are there to protect. And then you see a video of one of them choking an innocent man to death with his knee while everybody else is looking on. There is between evil and heroic, there is also a very fine line. So evil and holy. It's hard to know where the fine line is. We certainly know when somebody has stepped over it. Then it's very, very obvious. That's a very nice quote. Interesting thing. Tchaikovsky's famous quote, "Music is not an illusion, but rather a revelation." It's very beautiful, and it is probably sounds even more beautiful in Russian. But the revelation is such a wonderful word in itself. And if you start thinking what it is, it's something sort of presents itself to you, and you witnessing it out of nowhere, and it sort of makes you it's beautiful. I love that quote. I think it doesn't surprise me that it comes from Tchaikovsky, because it is poetic and it's beautiful, and it has a depth and poetry. I love it. An interesting question now. Greetings, Paavo. I remember when you did the crossover with Paul van Dyk. In your opinion, what's the best heritage of Tchaikovsky for music? Did he inspire for build a Russian patriotism? A Russian patriotism, that's a subject for a whole new discussion, because one of the things that we witness right now with Russia and the whole reoccurrence of Russian might, politically speaking, and the also musically speaking, one often starts questioning, well, where are the allegiance, and why are certain great Russian musicians still so close and stay so close to their government, and is it only because they're afraid to be persecuted, or is there something more? And it's very, very complex subject, because I think that even the most anti-Russian or anti-Soviet people during the Soviet era of repression stayed and faithful to the Russia and Russian culture and Russian heritage and Russian history, and Russia as a great nation and nation of great importance. And where is again the fine line? It's very hard to tell, because certainly Tchaikovsky, like all the other Russians, they were patriotic, even if not always, favorably disposed towards the governors of that time. They still they came from the soul and soil of Russia, and that is something that you cannot take away. The interesting thing, I was not speaking of Tchaikovsky, but I was lucky to be able to visit close to Lucerne. I was given access, very rare access, to the house and the estate of Rachmaninov that he built close to Lake Lucerne, and it's an amazingly beautiful, large estate which he designed himself. And the person who gave us the tour said that Rachmaninov brought wagons and wagons full on the train of Russian soil from Russia, an actual soil, and tons and tons of it, and planted it, and planted the trees and everything on that soil in Lucerne, because he felt that he cannot be away, and he needs a Russian soil to create and to feel whole. So in a way, I mean, it may sound a little bit over the top, but that's exactly what it is. There is patriotism and an undying connection to the culture, and not necessarily the love for the leaders. And like in so many cultures, people can be incredibly critical of their own country because they are in love with, and they can be critical. If you're critical about their country, you're going to be taught a very harsh lesson. So in a way, patriotism is a very tricky and many-faceted term. I think he's a very opinionated composer, and one can easily feel the emotion. How do you think he differs from the five? You're talking about Tchaikovsky. Well, I mean, Tchaikovsky is not part of the group of five, and I think Tchaikovsky is an aristocrat, and he's one of the kind. He's not somebody who, they spoke French at home, and they were incredibly westernized. They were very far from the kind of Russian peasant mentality that one would think when one thinks about Russia. It was an aristocratic and highly sophisticated layer of Russian society. So certainly he stands out. Dear Maestro, good evening. One of the tempo form questions in one development of the finale of the fifth is poco più animato, tempo primo pairing. Not all conductors do that. These tempo markings need to be taken seriously and literally at the same time. If you misjudge and calculate the gradation of tempi, then you can't get any faster. For example, you cannot do poco più animato once you took the earlier tempo too fast. Very often, for example, in a violin concerto, same things. There are certain menomosas written, for example, that some violinists do and others simply ignore. And it's just a question of not so much a tempo change. It's a matter of poco più animato doesn't always even mean a tempo change. It means more lively in character. And it always depends on how you got to that point. That's the basic misunderstanding with a lot of younger conductors is that saying, well, here he writes più mosso. So blindly they do più mosso. But what's important is what tempo are you at just before the più mosso? If you got to the point where you're too fast, or if you got to the point where you didn't control the gradation correctly, that più mosso makes absolutely no sense. So one needs to be aware, and sometimes it's not so easy to organize, because sometimes music has its very organic way of developing, and you're feeling that, okay, that's exactly how I want it to go, because it has a certain organic moment and momentum. And so by the time you get to that poco più mosso, you already might be in that poco più mosso tempo, and you don't need to necessarily have to have a shift, a sort of artificial tempo change, just because he writes it. It very much is a matter of thinking on your feet and feeling where you are at the moment. In my experience, it's not so easy to hear, but marking it with an orchestra outside Russia and new to the music was not easy. Do you have personal experience? Why that tempo change? Like I said, it's a matter of a little bit of a character, and depends on how you get there. It depends also how you interpret più mosso. Some people think it's faster, others think that it is just a change in character. Can you please recommend a great Tchaikovsky symphony cycle recording? Well, I think that there is one in making. I don't know how great it's going to be, but we certainly are going to try to make it the best we can. In Zurich, I really hope that you will have a chance to listen to our cycle in Zurich with the Tonhalle Orchestra, because we really put a lot of soul and hard work into it. And also, I must say that I have sort of made a decision not to worry so much about tradition, and not to worry about the kind of pre-existing opinions that this music often is accompanied by. So I do a lot of the things which I feel are right to me and which will benefit the music. let's see how you feel about it, but certainly do listen to it. As I said, in September we were releasing the first symphony, which is first CD, which is the Fifth Symphony, and Francesca da Rimini, one of the great pieces he really wrote, which I love, and I hope that you'll check it out. I am not sure I understand this question. Something about a woman who attacks you fiercely, fear for a man. Tchaikovsky's wife, Antonina, she's opposite of Clara Schumann. I think that there are perhaps some similarities, but also many differences between these two. Schumann lived a different life. Schumann has his own demons and his own stories, personal issues. But I think that his relationship to Clara was real, and produced children, and had a very complicated, but the relationship was definitely a real one. Tchaikovsky's first marriage, I think, had to do with pressures from society, and then he's sort of not being able to live a lie, and not being able to also come out as a gay man in that society. So I think that there are quite different circumstances. I think that also in Schumann's case, Clara was a real muse. It was a person who really was a kind of a co-writer, so to speak, was a muse. Tchaikovsky, I don't think, had one. Maybe Nadezhda von Meck was one of the people who was kind of an imaginary muse, but basically was a benefactor, somebody who allowed him to write because she paid the bills. Let's see, what else can we see? Very many questions all of a sudden, so forgive me please if I skip something by accident. Nadezhda von Meck and Tchaikovsky never met in person. Actually, I think they met once, and she quit the relationship suddenly, and how it was reflecting on his later works. I think it was when Nadezhda Meck quit, and I think it has something to do with finding out the personal circumstances of Tchaikovsky. It was so devastating because basically it was just the end of his financial stability, and also there was a lot of shame involved and so on. It was a different world. I think she, in a way, was a lifeline. I deeply appreciate your reply with full insight. Thank you. Tchaikovsky concerto, which I love to hear Midori play. Midori, we did a big tour with Estonian Festival Orchestra with Midori, and she's one of the great violinists and a great musical friend of mine, and also of the Estonian Festival Orchestra. So thank you for saying that. Have you ever tried composing or arranging pieces for the orchestra? Only much earlier, and I was not very good at it. Will you consider recording the famous ballet trilogy? I love the recordings of Swan Lake, Christian Järvi with the Gstaad Festival Orchestra. Yes, Christian has done a wonderful set of ballets. And what's interesting about Christian's recording is that he has made his own arrangements. So it's not just the famous suite, but they are quite involved, and they are very, very interesting and original take on all of this music, and it includes a lot of music that one often doesn't hear. So Christian's, check out the Christian's recordings, Christian's Tchaikovsky ballet recordings. They're all available on Spotify as well. Someday I hope to do at least the suites, but maybe even more with the ballets. This is possibly a part of a different project, but not the same project that we are now doing with Tonhalle. Tonhalle is basically the symphonies and some of the really important and big tone poems like Francesca, Romeo and Juliet, and a few others like Capriccio Espagnol and so on. Interesting insight here is interesting how different the same music is played by different performers. It's a luxury to be able to listen to the same music but with different performances. Well, this is actually one of the reasons why we still need orchestras and conductors and performers and so on. It's because I get often this question, it's like, well, this piece has been done already. Like, why do we really need you to conduct this piece? Because we know how it goes, musicians knows how it goes. And this is understandable. A normal person wouldn't understand why, why do you need to interpret Tchaikovsky 5? It's all there on the page and you just play the notes and it's beautiful. Well, there is very many things that are not on the page and depend on the point of view of the performer. And that's why these pieces are timeless, because they are so dependent on the point of view and also the historic findings of the conductors. If you look at the Beethoven symphonies, the score is always the same, but all of a sudden you hear Norrington and you feel that he has totally just demolished everything that we knew about Beethoven before, with all the tempi and all the articulation and so on. So it is really not the fact that he changed anything in the score. He just had a historic perspective and a view and enough expertise and enough conviction from reading and studying the music of that period that he was convinced that we actually are not looking at this music in a way that composer intended. So the performer is always part of an integral part of music. Music doesn't exist without a performer. If you listen to this famous story when a lady came up to Heifetz after the Carnegie Hall performance and said, "Maestro, your violin sounds so beautiful." And Heifetz picked up the violin, put it to his head, and said, "I don't hear anything." And the violin doesn't sound. The violin sounds only when the violinist plays it. And that's exactly how the score sounds. Score only sounds when orchestra plays it and the conductor interprets it. So we don't have to be too worried about being out of work from that perspective. Good evening, Maestro. Would like to know what you think while you conduct and what your opinion about the introduction of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony. I'm a bassoon player. Well, that's the place for a bassoon player to kind of show his mastery or his or her mastery, and it is to me always this sort of moment when you kind of you almost think quietly to yourself. You might and you're thinking thoughts that can get you in a lot of trouble, and you don't want anybody else to know, and you're kind of muttering to yourself. And very often Shostakovich, and why I find that Shostakovich has taken a lot from Tchaikovsky in that way, that these long introductions and quiet, slow, dark introductions have to do with a kind of state of mind and building up the state of mind of the composer, and really muttering almost to yourself the kind of place that you are mentally in, and things you don't want other people to know. And then the sort of curtain opens, and you have more public music that is meant to be seen by more than one person, or at least you dare to say to somebody else. So that beginning is unbelievably delicate. It's also difficult to start in the beginning so that it doesn't have an accent. But this sense of license, I think, is very important, and a sense of naturally, organically evolving line. One of the mistakes, or not mistakes necessarily, but what I always find happens is that very, very good bassoon players who truly are masters of their instrument want to play it very beautifully. And playing something like this very beautifully actually kind of negates the whole purpose. I think that it's like playing Rite of Spring, as if it is a some kind of a Debussy melody. It needs to have heaviness. It needs to have this sort of feeling like you're waking up in a ditch with an incredible hangover, and sort of surprised that you're still alive. It has this sense of sort of vodka induced sort of, what's the meaning of life? Why am I still alive? Where am I? And why am I sort of here? And how did I even get here? That feeling, in a way. But it doesn't necessarily, everybody can have their own interpretation of that beginning. But for me, the one thing it isn't is the kind of the kind of beautiful, that comes later. But in the beginning, it needs to be like every note needs to be played as if it's really difficult to play the next one. Just exactly like in a Rite of Spring. It needs to be almost like you have this feeling like it's almost impossible to play the next note. Anyway, that's my view on it. Thank you for talking about Tchaikovsky. Russians are in general very warm and emotional, and I love him because he touches hearts. Which composition of his do you love most, or of all besides symphonies? It's a very good question. I mean, the piece that I really love is Francesca da Rimini, because it is so intense, and it is so dramatic, and it is relentless and totally, breathtaking. One of my favorite pieces is a second piano concerto. I find the second piano concerto personally more attractive at least to me, and the slow movement of the second concerto is out of this world beautiful, especially with this trio. One of the keys, I think, and this is something that I am very lucky, because I remember discovering Onegin, and the way I discovered Onegin is when I was a kid and we were in Soviet Union. My father was asked to perform Onegin in Metropolitan Opera, and that, for an Estonian conductor living in Soviet Union, is an amazing opportunity and honor. And I remember him coming back and playing these tapes at the time, and I remember him also conducting it in Buenos Aires and in Teatro Colón. So my love for Onegin came through my father, who was kind of enthused about this music, and if you know Onegin, which many of you I know do know, then you see how connected all his music and are to these words. We were very fortunate in the summer in Pärnu festival last summer. We had Ain Anger, an Estonian bass, a great Estonian bass, sing a Gremins aria, and everybody was in tears. And because the gestures and the words, and if one understands the connection and the way he writes "Безумно я люблю Татьяну," it is something that you can then almost immediately transport to all the other music, and that gesture of depth and the sound. And the thing about Russian music, and it's very similar and very easy to kind of forget, and it could also become a cliche easily, is that there is, like all music, of course, is connected to the language, and there is there is something fundamentally, in my opinion, missing in listening to a lot of Western orchestras playing Tchaikovsky, because it sounds very efficient, it sounds very lean, and it has a very kind of a Western ideal of orchestral sound, which I think in Russian music it lacks a little bit of color. It lacks the color necessary to make these words come alive. I mean, if you look at the connection between the music and the language, if in the word sound in English is sound. In German it's Klang. In French, sonorité. Russian, zvuk. I mean, it's so obvious how all of these words already show the difference between the approach, the sound world of each composer or each culture. So one needs to keep that very much in mind, especially with Russian music, because that can become really, for me, very often rather plain in just on the layers of color in the Western world. When I listen to Tchaikovsky, I like to follow his beat. Well, how do you think about it? I want to know, because you studied percussion in university. You should be good at beat of any kind of music. Well, as every music, the fundamental thing about every music is rhythm. There's rhythm and there's harmony, but even more important than harmony, in a very primordial, basic way, is rhythm. It's the heartbeat. So an orchestra or a performance that doesn't rhythmically have sort of, what's the right word, is not settled rhythmically and is rhythmically ambiguous, will never be satisfying, because it lacks the heartbeat and it lacks the bone structure. You cannot build on anything if the rhythm and the rhythmical structure is not well executed and well thought through. Hello, Yalta. You grew up with your father's interpretation of Tchaikovsky music. What do you do differently? What are you particularly looking for his music when conducting yourself? Well, I don't try to do particularly anything but differently for the sake of doing things differently. But what I do want to do is not to be a slave to the things that I heard when I was a kid. I want to see if there are certain things that make more sense and it usually happened when certain traditions don't make sense. There are certain rallentandi, certain accelerandi, certain subito pianos, echoes, things like that, which are kind of always there because everybody always does them. But why? Nobody really sort of knows why. because they've heard somebody else do it. And I don't want to be different for the sake of being different, but I have courage now, after 30 years of conducting, to actually do the things that I want to hear in the music, rather than the things that have for the last 25 years not made sense, and sort of go with the flow, perpetuating the same sort of question mark and status quo. What's the hardest lesson when you learned in front of the orchestra as a young conductor? Hardest lesson was well, there are so many hard lessons. You have to know your score, and you have to be polite and respectful to musicians. Musicians, when you're a young conductor, then most of the musicians who sit in front of you know a million times more than you do, and then they played that piece with 10 different conductors, and you're doing it for the first time. So the first thing you do, stop telling about your opinions to the orchestra, say good morning, Tchaikovsky, and start playing music, and see what you are presented with. And very often what an orchestra can present you with is much better than you thought you can teach them. And this gradually, over the period of years, will equalize, and then you have certain things that you can and want to tell them and ask them to do and reconsider. But that's only because you have genuinely earned this right to suggest certain things, because you've gone through the process. But mistakes, I mean, there are basically every step you make is going to be probably a mistake in a young conductor's life, from the way you say hello to the way you get stuck on one little detail and forget to play through the whole symphony, and then musicians then don't know how the rest of the music goes, because you've been working on same 5 bars forever and ever and ever. So there are a lot. The best to be very self-critical and listen to the opinions of your musical friends and musicians in front of you. Time flies. It's again been almost 2 hours. So forgive me if I haven't answered some of your questions, because today there were really a lot of questions and they go really quickly by on my screen here. But from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for joining me, and thank you for keeping me company. And I hope that some of those answers were illuminating and maybe helpful. If nothing else, then maybe renews your appetite to hear some of the early symphonies of Tchaikovsky, and renew the quest of listening to a few unknown scores of Tchaikovsky. And there are a lot of pieces by Tchaikovsky that are simply not played at all, and many of them deserve a second hearing. So, my friends, I'd like to say goodbye. I'd like to end with saying that the turmoil in the world right now, and especially what happens in the United States right now, is so grave that we musicians have a role to play. We need to speak up and have opinions about, and voice our opinions about what's going on in the world, because one of the biggest and most disappointing mistakes that artists in our profession make is that we feel that our voices are not heard, and maybe we shouldn't be political. We have to be political, and don't be influenced by some wise comments saying, oh, just shut up and play music, because stay away from politics. Don't stay away from politics. Voice your opinions. The stuff and the kind of thing that happened in the United States last week is inexcusable, and it is totally threatening our democracy everywhere and human dignity everywhere. So don't be silent. Voice your opinions, and we pray for everybody who is going through an unbelievably difficult time right now. So, peace, my friends. See you next time. Stay safe.